Many of you have travel on your mind as you may be preparing to go home today or tomorrow. And I don't know what your reaction has been when you're driving on the highway and you see a sign like deer crossing, big image of a deer. Or maybe up in the mountains, you see the sign that says, watch out for falling rock, with the different size rocks and falling on the road. And if you're a driver, have you ever asked yourself, well, I appreciate the sign, but what are they really expecting me to do about this? Am I supposed to go real slow? So the drivers around me are not really doing that. What am I actually supposed to do about this? And then we probably challenge ourselves, or ask ourselves, we don't really know. So what are the chances really that that's going to happen when I'm driving through? Statistically, right, it's not going to be me. Well, years ago, when I was an undergraduate, I went to Spain studying abroad. And I don't know if it was due to the guide's lack of mastery of the English language, or maybe they were running out of things to say on this particular tour, but we had a tour guide join our bus as we were approaching this small town of Cuenca, just outside of Spain. If you want to see what I'm talking about, you can look up, after Mass, Cuenca, Spain, limestone. And the roads going into this beautiful, very picturesque town outside of Madrid are these roads that go under all of these different rock formations. And they're very nicely curved out. And as the guide was telling us, what's happening over the course of thousands and thousands of years is that as rain falls and it runs from the top of the rock to the bottom, the different consistency of acids and bases and such in the water erode the very soft limestone. And over time, the top gets too heavy for the bottom to support it, and it falls down. And so as we're going around this winding road into the city, he's saying, yep, and these could fall at any moment, Now, as a young person, I'm on the bus, I'm not driving, I don't really know what I can do about this, but I look down in the valley and I see boulders the size of Volkswagens that have done this. And so sure enough, every time we go around the corner, every time we see another boulder, it prompts our tour guide to say, yep, these rocks, they're all decaying and they could fall at any moment. And I just remember getting so frustrated with them. What about the other calamities that we hear about? Old Faithful at Yellowstone, a super volcano underneath it. If it were to erupt, would change life in America as we know it for generations. Or the San Andreas Fault, or pick your natural disaster that, if the worst case scenario came about, would be devastating for us, and many people would not make it. Well, I have some good news for you. I was researching in preparation for these analogies, these images, and there's only a 7% chance that the San Andreas Fault will have a magnitude 8 earthquake within the next 30 years. And, for us in Florida, we can live with that because we're in Florida. Old Faithful, hopefully this is encouraging, only a 1 in 730,000 chance that it will erupt in a supervolcano in any given year. Scientists are hopeful for the next 1,000 years we're good. But for those of you who bought a Powerball ticket, just to compare the odds, 1 in 730,000, but if you thought, maybe there's a chance I can win the Powerball, 1 in 292 million. So there's always a chance. How do we contrast this with the signs that Jesus is speaking of and the warnings he gives us in our gospel today? Well, first of all, he gives us a 100% chance that the end will come, whether it is his return at the end of time or the end of our life. The end for us will come. This Advent is a time for us to remember the 4 last things: death, judgment, heaven, and hell. 100% certainty. And unlike the above calamities we mentioned, where there's virtually no way to prepare on a daily basis, Jesus is calling us to take action now, to be prepared and to stay awake. Now notice, that is a twofold command. First of all, to prepare yourself But then, once prepared, to stay vigilant. We can't just seek to prepare, check the box, and go back to cruise control. A good start may be to ask, well, how ready do I feel today? Am I ready? Do I feel ready? That's a good question, but it's not where we stop. It's just the beginning. We have to realize a couple biases with this question. First of all, we're self-assessing. No one likes to say that they're not as ready as they should be. No one likes to feel unprepared. Have you ever been told to reread the instructions? Maybe for you students, you're told, the teacher tells you, make sure you read the instructions again and again before you submit your paper or your project. Or for adults, that could be the case, or maybe a recipe. You should check it twice. But how many times do we say, well, I've read them before. I got the gist of it. I'm pretty confident in my reading comprehension. I don't feel like going back and reading the instructions again. I'm too far along. I'm just going to turn in the work that I've done and hope for the best. Can we see those biases at work in our life? A second bias to be aware of is that we're biased toward a static assessment. I'm either prepared or I'm not, but then I just want to move on. Sometimes we're just tired of thinking about that project, that test, that exam, that judgment. We prepare minimally and then hope for the best. But over time, if we do not review our preparations and keep watch, for example, at each and every hurricane season, the batteries in our hurricane kit go bad. Food goes stale. And we stop paying attention to the weather. Our challenge is not to think about the coming of one day and just say, I guess I'm ready. We're not just to be statically prepared and then move on. But we are called to behave consistently according to our preparation. Jesus is commanding us to prepare, and once prepared, to stay awake and to keep watch for that unknown day and that unknown hour. Many of you have been watching or attending sports events recently with Rivalry Week. Well, I want to talk about a game not related to this week, but actually in reference to a priest who is talking about his father's sudden death. There's a point to this with sports. Just follow me here for 1 second. So this priest was giving the homily at his own father's funeral. And he incorporated how he died and when he died. This priest was from Michigan, and his father was an avid Michigan basketball fan. And he was at one of their games when he had a sudden heart attack and died in his seat. And some people approached the priest and said, oh, I'm so sorry. You didn't have any warning, and it was so sudden, and I don't know, maybe it's kind of embarrassing that your father died at a basketball game. Like, you would kind of hope he would, in his chair praying the rosary or, attending daily mass or some other pious event. And the priest said, no, quite to the contrary. My father was ready. And because he was ready, it's beautiful that he died in the midst of something that he loved and did all the time. Because he was looking for that day. He was longing to meet Jesus face to face. And then humorously the priest added, and it was appropriate that my father died when he did because he died at Michigan basketball games many times. Let's bring back that sobering question to ourselves. If we were to die this week, what would we be doing? And would the people around us confidently say that we were ready? Jesus tells us that at the end of time it will be as it was in the time of Noah. Now imagine Noah was building an ark when the sky was clear and the land was dry. Meanwhile, people were buying houses and trading and dining and marrying and living carefree. We also remember this was an unjust generation, very unjust. There was abundant sin, but not always immediate consequences. There was a cultural reinforcement of an erroneous conscience. We heard in our second reading about the works of darkness, orgies and drunkenness, promiscuity and lust, rivalry and jealousy. And they were probably thinking, well, let's eat, drink, and be merry, and worry about the consequences of our actions some other day. Try to imagine how Noah was possibly ridiculed by his neighbors, taking on this massive project when there's no forecast for rain. I mean, just imagine if you took some of your valuable possessions or your prized stocks and you cashed them in to start digging a storm shelter in your backyard. What would the reaction of your neighbors be? And imagine as it was in the days of Noah. But all who failed to prepare were swept away in the flood. So it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. Jesus is warning us to be prepared and to stay awake. The church in its wisdom gives us the passing of liturgical seasons as we've now begun Advent. We have signs of the passing of time in the Advent wreath to remind us that the day will come, though we know not when. But how do we prepare our lives? I know one family, and I think this is popular in some circles, that one of the ways that families help their children have the mindset of preparing is, in addition to maybe an Advent calendar or setting out the nativity set in stages maybe, one family has the practice of a little crib where every time their children do something that is becoming of one who is expecting Jesus to come, preparing for baby Jesus, they put maybe a cloth, a strip of cloth, or a straw in the crib. And it's wonderful for the children to see, wow, look at how full this crib is and how well prepared we are to show Jesus how much we love him in our neighbor. But every time the child does something wrong, every time they break a rule or do something unkind, the parents say, okay, well, let's take a piece of cloth away. And that sense of I don't want to see what is a reflection of my actions, that I did something not preparing myself, undoing my preparation. And it can be not something to shame us or to guilt us, but just to say, let's try to do better tomorrow and let's stay prepared. For us as adults, how are we preparing ourselves? Are we just looking to external actions to review? Or are we going a step further and longing for that personal encounter with Jesus at the end of time? How desiring are we for the Lord to come, to meet him face to face? And does our behavior each and every day support the claim? So if you're asking, well, Father, how do I really know if I'm prepared? I don't really know where to start. I would encourage you to start with your daily life. How do you prepare for the day when you wake? Do I wake up early enough to pray for the grace to be faithful each day? Do I nourish my soul with scripture and prayer as much as I nourish my body with food? Am I resolved to grow in faith? And are there any resolutions that I keep putting off? How do I look out for Jesus disguised in my neighbor? Also, consider the end of the day. How do I use the end of the day to prepare for the end of my life? Do I remember that each day is an undeserved gift and that tomorrow is not guaranteed? Do I review the day and make an act of contrition before going to bed? in addition to asking God for forgiveness for what I've done or failed to do I make at least one resolution of how I can do better tomorrow? How do I prepare for Mass? First, do I resolve to go to Mass every weekend? Do I ask Jesus to increase my desire for him in word and sacrament? During the week, do I make a spiritual communion to stay united with him in my heart? How do I prepare to go to confession? Well, first of all, do I go to confession? Or do I rationalize all the reasons why I don't need to go? Now, for those of you who are afraid to confess to another person, to a priest, realize that it is certain that you will confess to Jesus on the last day. And if you have any nervousness about that, then realize that every time you go to confession, it's like a dress rehearsal. But not just a practice, it actually affects the forgiveness that it promises. And the sins you confess and are converted from now will not be held against you at your judgment. But for those who allow their fear of going to prevent them from going, you will have to answer for all of those sins on the last day. How do I maintain and deepen my love for God and others, especially those who are most in need of love and care? I conclude reminding us of the words in our second reading today. Brothers and sisters, you know the time. It is now the hour for you to wake from sleep, for our salvation is nearer than when we first believed. The night is advanced, the day is at hand. Then throw off the works of darkness. Put on the armor of light. Put on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make no provision for the desires of the flesh. Jesus is coming, and how we prepare our hearts and our lives will determine our response to that unknown day and unknown hour. Will our response to Jesus be, "Did you have to come now? This isn't fair. I thought I had more time. I'm not ready." Or could it be, "Welcome, Jesus. I'm so glad you're here. I gave my life to you long ago, and I am ready to give it to you now. I've been longing for this day, and now my heart rejoices to see you face to face."